Hello, Serve-Wellers. As you know by now, if you decide to attend a service academy or an ROTC program, you will have a 5-year commitment to the military after graduation. I like to call it a guaranteed job. This is a significant commitment. If this intimidates you, understand that you are not alone. I had some of the very same reservations when I was in high school. I was recruited by the Naval Academy to play basketball. And unfortunately, I didn't have anyone who could give me some perspective on what I was being offered. Yes, the coaches did the very best that they could, but as a 17-year-old with limited information, I wasn't mature enough to know how to process the information. My parents didn't have any military background, so they weren't of much use in that regard. At the time, I was an athlete. I had a very short-term perspective, and I just couldn't get over the 5-year commitment. And so I chose a more traditional path. I said no thank you to the Naval Academy and yes to Yale University, where I played basketball for 4 years. By the way, at the time, I had never even heard of ROTC before, so a lot has changed since then. Now, I don't know for sure if I would have made a different decision if I had a mentor helping me think through the different scenarios, but I definitely would have given these opportunities a lot more consideration. So what I'd like to do today is to walk through a typical 10-year path for a student who takes the traditional college route versus someone who decides to go to a service academy or an ROTC program. Let's start with the traditional 4-year college experience. For one, to go to a school, a college, a university with the equivalent resources and prestige and reputation as a service academy, you will be expected to pay about $90,000 a year. That's as of this taping. Probably going to be a lot more very soon. So if you spread that out over 4 years, you're looking at a total college bill of about $350,000 plus. Now, some colleges have need-based financial aid programs that might reduce that cost if your parents don't make a lot of money, but otherwise, you'll be responsible for that total expense. So let's assume for the time being that your family makes $200,000 a year, which probably puts you just out of reach for most need-based financial aid. So the bottom line is you'll have to fit the whole bill. This happens all the time. Families, by the way, don't typically have that type of money sitting around in a drawer. So you and your parents have to take out student loans. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you take out $150,000 of student loans over the course of 4 years. So you've got that to grapple with. Now, what about job prospects? Let's assume you attend a school like Amherst, and you really aren't sure what you want to do after college, so you major in communications. When you graduate, what are your prospects? Well, obviously, there are a lot of factors at play here, but let's just say that your communications degree, which is pretty generic, doesn't exactly get you that far with the on-campus recruiting, and you don't get a full-time offer for a job coming out of college, or at least one that you think is worth it. What happens next? By the way, don't forget that you still have $150,000 in student loan debt that's now due, and you've got to start servicing that debt or paying that debt back. So you move back home and you live with your parents in your old bedroom. You don't have a job that will pay for your own apartment and your school loan, so you figure one way to reduce costs is to live at home. And lo and behold, you find out that it's not that easy to get a job even when you're living at home. Your college major was somewhat generic, and the fancy jobs went to the students with the fancy majors, often from the fancier colleges. And after a few weeks, maybe even months, your parents start to get antsy. They want to know what you're up to. Unfortunately, you're not up to much. You're posting your resume on random job boards, and your post-graduation momentum is slowing down. So to make sure that you don't spend an entire year without a job, you take a job as a barista at the Starbucks down the street. You figure, this is only temporary. At least it'll get your parents off your back for a little while. Surely something will come along that's better soon. Well, 2 years later, you are promoted to the assistant store manager at the same Starbucks, and you're now in charge of 3 other employees. And you're still being paid by the hour. You've barely made a dent in your $150,000 school loans. And this part-time work has caused your job hunt for a better job to start losing steam. In fact, you're not even sure what kind of job you're even searching for anymore. And by the time you're 5 years out of college, you're still living at home. Your student loan is still over $120,000, but you've finally gotten a real job. Because after some soul searching, you decided that you wanted to become a journalist. So to get your foot in the door, you took a job as an entry-level researcher at a regional news outlet. So now you sit at home 8 hours a day researching news stories remotely. Admittedly, it's not the most exciting job in the world, but at least it's something. And you hope and pray and maybe assume that this will allow you to eventually move up the ranks to become some kind of legit beat reporter for one of the mainstream news outlets, at which point you can move out of your parents' house. Now, it's 10 years after college. You still have $100,000 in student loans. You're still living at home, but you've just landed a new job as an assistant editor of an online research journal. And that's where we're going to leave this story for now. Okay, now we're going to switch gears. We're going to see where someone who went to a service academy might end up after 10 years. And you can imagine a very similar scenario for students who attend college on an ROTC scholarship. But for the purposes of clarity, let's assume this person went to a service academy, the Naval Academy. As you know by now, everybody who attends a service academy is on full scholarship. They pay $0 for their education. In fact, midshipmen and cadets are actually paid a stipend of a few $100s a month while they're at the academy for 4 years. And that amount increases every year at the academy. So financially speaking, attending a service academy could represent a swing of several hundreds of thousands of dollars to the benefit of the midshipmen, the cadet, and their families. In terms of your major, since the Naval Academy, and all the service academies for that matter, are tech-focused, you end up majoring in a subject that has wide applicability in the real world. Let's call it electrical engineering. This is a degree that will command a ton of respect and money outside of the military if you decide to leave the military after your 5-year career, what I like to call affectionately the 5-year guaranteed job. You graduate from the academy and you are assigned to work on a 5,000-person floating city, also known as an aircraft carrier, and you set off to see the world. As a newly minted ensign, that's the name of your rank as a new naval officer, you're in charge of a department on that aircraft carrier. In other words, you are overseeing and responsible for maybe 40 to 50 enlisted personnel. And your job is to make sure that you lead them and that they do their jobs well. You might be in charge of a propulsion room or the flight deck or a nuclear weapons cache. No matter what it is, you're accumulating real-world skills, you're learning daily lessons in leadership, and you're experiencing different parts of the world, cultures of the world. And by the way, you're not living in your parents' house. You're also getting paid. You may be making $80,000 a year, every year for those 5 years. After all, this is your full-time job. And since you're deployed a lot of the time, and you often have some of your housing paid for, you can save a lot of that money if you play your cards right. Let's fast forward to the end of your 5-year commitment / guaranteed job, and boy, has that time flown by. To start with, you don't have any student loan debt at all, 0. In fact, quite the opposite. By making smart financial decisions and not buying motorcycles in Germany and other frivolous purchases, you actually saved $100,000 over the last 9 years, starting with your undergraduate work in the academy all the way through your 5 years of your guaranteed job. You are in a great financial position. So, what are your options? Well, if you like what you've been doing, you can stay and enjoy life in the military as a naval officer, as an Army officer, as an Air Force officer, with all the advantages and disadvantages attendant to that lifestyle. And even if you ultimately decide to leave the Navy, it sure is nice to have options. So what are some of those options? If you decide to leave, or what we call separate from the Navy, from the Army, from the Air Force, you're in such a great financial position that you can do almost anything you want. You can look for a traditional job in the private or the public sector. You could travel the world for a year with just a backpack. You could buy a franchise. You could start your own business. You can invest in the stock market. You could buy a fixer-upper single-story home. You can put a down payment on a duplex. You can apply to law school, business school. You can do whatever you want. Not only do you have zero financial pressure, but you have built up a resume with 5 years of real-world leadership experience in a very high-stress and high-stakes environment. By the time you would leave the Navy after 5 years, you may have been in charge of 200 or 300 people or more. I can't think of another career path where a 26 or a 27-year-old would be given that level of responsibility. And of course, after all of your experiences and your challenges, of course, you will have built up a huge reservoir of confidence and belief in yourself that you can do things, you can actually do stuff. And this confidence in your ability to succeed, no matter what life throws at you, we call this having agency, will carry you on for decades to come. Okay, I just laid out 2 very different scenarios based on whether you chose a traditional college path or a service academy or ROTC path. Which of these 2 paths gets you more excited? Which do you think you would be more apt to follow? The truth is, even though 5 years sounds like a long time, and I know it does, and you might be worried that your non-military peers will be way far ahead of you in the real world, it's simply not the case anymore. Getting a traditional job in the real world today is no joke, especially if you don't have a commercially viable degree with a commercially viable major. You could languish in no man's land for a long time before getting on track. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of what happens when you graduate from the Naval Academy or West Point or the Air Force, leading sailors, soldiers, airmen. It's not a guarantee of a perfectly smooth transition to the civilian world if you choose to get out of the military after 5 years. But man, it sure has its advantages. So if you're stuck on this issue of a 5-year commitment post-graduation or post-guaranteed job, I hope, if nothing else, I have convinced you to at least think about it, consider it more deeply before making any rash decisions. Until next week, continue to study hard, play hard, and don't forget to serve others.